Hello, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me on another presentation and interview from experts across the world. This time, we're going down the legal route, and I've got with me Professor Augusto Zimmerman from Perth in Australia, who is going to share with us his ideas, his thoughts, his reasoning around some of the issues that came up in the pandemic. These are very important legal principles. And oftentimes, especially because we don't know the law as well as we should, we really need help to make sure that everything that we're doing is within the framework of the law to protect the population at hand. So let's get straight in. We have got here, do you mind if I call you Augusto?
No problem at all. That's my first name.
Excellent. So, Augusto, I think that it's important for us to start with a little bit about you, where you are, what your background is. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I was born in Rio de Janeiro uh, a long time ago and migrated to Australia in 2001 to do a PhD at Monash University. And as soon as concluded my PhD, I spent only 6 months in Brazil and was invited to return by a good friend of mine, who is now a very good friend of mine, Professor Gabriel Moines. And he was the dean of Murdoch University. I was invited then to be just a lecturer. But over the years, I ascended in my career and became associate dean for research eventually. That's when I was also invited to be a law reform commissioner. Now I have opened a legal theory association, have a law journal, and was for a couple of years the vice president of the Australian Society of Legal Philosophy, amongst
Wow,
other
that,
things.
that's that's tremendous. So your Brazilian roots in Rio de Janeiro, are you a footballer by any chance?
I was a good soccer player. I was even thinking potentially to become a professional soccer player, but my father persuaded me to seek a different path in my life.
Wow, that no, that's fascinating. I'm a bit of a football fanatic myself, so we can discuss that at another time. So when you decided to leave Brazil to go
Mm.
to Australia, how was that transition for you?
It was interesting. I was not expected to face a society that so much, I could say, relying on government. I mean, Melbourne was a surprise to me because my impression of the Australians was that they were very uh, independent and had this culture of suspicion of government. But that's not my experience at all. I was always suspicious that one day uh, this would end up in tragedy because the welfare state, the idea of the government being the ultimate provider, would generate this sort of confidence in government that could as it was used in a terrible manner by those who occupy positions of power to increase their control over society and to impose measures that ultimately violating not only the rule of law generally speaking, but violating the constitution of Australia that was pretty much disregarded over the last 3 years or so.
That's interesting. One of the questions about you, Augusto, is that you've always been outspoken, meaning that even before all of the pandemic issues came about, you were challenging many of the issues in Australia about the Aboriginal community.
Mhm.
Why did you take that kind of stance, especially as somebody who was not Australian?
Yes, because I became a law academic out of my concern for justice and protection of human rights. I remember in a conversation with my dad, he asked me, "Why do you want to be studying political science?" And I told him that's because I like the area. I like to talk about politics. But then he gave me the best advice that a father could give. You should be actually a legal academic and study constitutional law because then you'll be able to discuss politics but also perhaps potentially be in the legal profession. And that's what I did. But my concern about what is happening to the Aborigines is that they are enslaved by a ruling class that basically takes advantage of their condition of dependency. And another thing is that it's almost like a social Darwinian construct to think that the white elites can actually look after the Aborigines better than the Aborigines themselves, and this is actually destroying their families. It's turning them into entirely enslaved by the so-called welfare state, and also promoting a politics of division, of separating people into lines of ethnicity, religion, and etc. So I just thought that this was the reintroduction of the ancient Roman strategy of divide and conquer. So these strategies applied for thousands of years, and some people are still foolish enough to fall into the trap.
And you dovetailed right into something. So with that kind of background and this kind of focus, when the COVID pandemic then came, did this automatically it, did you automatically see the connections?
Of course, because I was, as I mentioned, a law reform commissioner. I don't know if I mentioned, but I'm mentioning now. Apart from being a legal academic, I served the law reform commission in Western Australia for 5 years and was appointed by the then Attorney General. My interactions with the political elite were not very pleasant. I wouldn't even describe themselves as necessarily being an elite. They behave in an oligarchical fashion. But I could notice the disregard of these people for the ordinary citizen, and the fact that they sometimes discussed the ideas that were counterproductive to the well-being of the community, even discussing things that raise my concern regarding population control, for instance, and even overpopulation, claiming that Australia is overpopulated. These people are completely mad. I mean, Western Australia is scarcely populated, and they come up with these strange ideas. So I have never trusted in government enough to think that they always want the well-being of everyone. So I have, in my opinion, at least that's what I think, being always very healthily suspicious of government intentions, the intentions of government. And I think that is a very healthy approach that prevents us from being inoculated sometimes with things that you do not necessarily have the confidence that they will be working.
You know, the part of what we're going to be focused on is the issue about COVID-19 pandemic, the legal precedents around vaccine mandates, and so on. But this is why I'm building that background to see that you, one, are not afraid to speak about controversial issues.
Mhm.
Let me ask you, you must have noticed that you seem to be a rare voice. Why
Yeah.
is it that more people are not speaking? What is your thought on that?
I think there are two things. One is cowardly behavior. That some of these people know that I am taking an approach that, according to them, is the most desirable, but they do not have the courage to speak out. Sometimes because I understand that they have families to raise, they have a salary to receive, and they don't want to lose these things. So that's one of the reasons. The other is idolatry of government. Some people, I think this is potentially a result of the decline of the Christian faith or faiths in general, of religion in general, that these people have an idolatry of government, and they really believe that the government is going to save them. And whatever the government does, it must be blindly agreed with and even followed. So there is this combination of factors, and I think many people have lost their sense of self-respect and or
Mm.
their sense of self-dignity, and they probably think that it might give too much work to have to use his or her own brain. So it's better to actually rely on what the government says, and then, of course, blame the government because it's not a decision made by the person, him or herself.
Wow. So now I'm going to pull you back in history because I'm going to take your name, Zimmermann.
Mm.
Zimmermann is a German name. What are your German connections in relation to the history that I think I'm going to refer to?
It's always a bit complicated to be discussing that particular period of time because of my German name. But of course, I must say that my grandfather, speaking a perfect German and coming from Germany, he actually fought against the Nazis in the Second World War, serving the Brazilian army. He was an air pilot. And he always taught in my family us to be free, to fight for freedom and human rights. I must say that I'm so blessed to have come from a family that there is this concern for individual rights and freedoms. So I think another characteristic coming from my family is the fact that we know history. And I have always been taught by my father about the past. And you know that those who do not know history will be condemned to repeat history and perhaps to potentially make this new return of ancient ideas even worse because of the advancement of technology. So I'm really concerned about the repetition of certain elements from the past, including this idea that people should be daubing on others, should be accusing others of not being complacent and compliant enough. And I saw some developments that really disturbed me because it was not just the behavior of the governments, it was the behavior of the population in general. And that's one of the approaches taken by these parasitical ruling classes. What they really want is to make it impossible for neighbors to get together, for friends to join uh, themselves in meetings and having a proper life. I think this COVID madness, this whole 3 years, separated people. And when you separate people, people started to actually get the information from the mainstream media and get also antisocial. And I can see this phenomenon taking place of people who basically now stay at home, even being told by the employers to stay at home because they um, can even be less financially of a burden to their employers.
That's some very powerful stuff. And I think that I agree with you, Augusto, in that history is very, very important in terms of understanding where we are now. And I think that sometimes people think that the association with the Nazi regime in World War II is going too far, meaning that
Mm.
it's not at all connected, not at all similar. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, the legal profession and the medical profession were very compliant with the Nazi regime, and they would be operating in such a manner as to undermine their own code of ethics. And I saw this taking place over here when judges in Australia and even members of the legal profession didn't have any consideration for the rule of law, for the protection of individual rights and freedoms, because they took an approach that everything must be obeyed and that the government has the final say on these matters. So if the government has the final say on these matters, the government is God and then can actually remove any individual rights and freedom. But that's not part of our legal tradition. So what makes me quite worried about this whole thing is that most of the legal profession now do not know basic principles of the common law. And I think this is the case because they do not teach history, legal history, in law schools anymore. And some law schools don't even teach jurisprudence. So these are just the operators of the legal system and do whatever the government tells them to do. That reminds me of the behavior of the German society during that particular period of time that actually idolized the leader. So when you think of, now we know Hitler is bad, an evil man, but the German society adored him, and he was more popular than most of these current tyrants. So, I mean, to say that Hitler was evil, we now know, and that he had always been evil, but he was adored and loved by the German people, to the point, of course, that he didn't have to rig the elections, as some appear to be doing now, to be chosen by the German people. So popularity doesn't mean that the person is necessarily a good person, or it's going to be protecting our fundamental rights and freedoms, and quite to the contrary.
One of the things that I saw that you had mentioned in an article was that remarkably, some of the greatest supporters of the Nazi regime were doctors and lawyers.
Mhm.
What was the historical connection there?
Well, the lawyers had an authoritarian attitude towards the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic in Germany was not very popular because it was constituted after the defeat, or the apparent defeat, of the Germans in the First World War. And they felt humiliated by those who claimed the victory. And they were also sympathetic to a strong government that could fix the problems of the society, because the Germans were facing social crisis, an economic crisis, and an inflation, a high inflation. And Hitler appeared pretty much as a messiah, as a healer, as a person who could heal the society from its diseases. And even the treatment of the Jews was based on the medicalization of society. So, in this sense, it's quite interesting when you have the demonization of people who do not comply with the measures that are imposed coercively imposed by government, because that is very similar to that particular moment in history. So there are some analogies between what happened in the 1930s during the Nazi regime and what's happening right now. Of course, we have to be careful about these analogies, and I'm not going to extrapolate on them.
Yes, I think some of the things that I thought were very concerning was the issue about the perception of the unvaccinated as being
Mhm.
almost the harbinger of disease and of risk to the public, and that's probably one of the ways that we had that analogy, and it was based around a flawed understanding of the science, because I think that the politicians at the time were under the idea that if you vaccinate everyone, you would stop the pandemic. And so they put that information across to the public. And so therefore the public naturally was saying anyone who does not comply is prolonging the whole
Yeah.
process. And I don't think the public has understood yet the significance of that information that was passed on to them wasn't actually scientifically accurate. How
Absolutely.
mm,
Yeah,
how do we go ahead, go ahead.
no, look, you are absolutely right. And I have mentioned in some of my papers the shocking very disgusting treatment of those who didn't comply or were not subject to this experiment. Even to the point of a lady in Melbourne who had a heart condition. I don't know if you were aware of the fact that she was refused to undergo a heart transplant because she was not vaccinated. And the funny thing about this is that we know, according to very credible uh, research journals, medical research journals, that one of the most common conditions that people who got adverse effects from this experiment is myocarditis. It's a heart attacks and things like that. And I have witnessed many of even my friends having this problem. And
Mm.
this lady was refused medical treatment, heart treatment, because they wanted to force her to take a vaccine that is actually, some people claim, that's causing heart conditions. So this is total madness. And the
Well,
level of
let me give some
persecution, yes.
yeah, let me give some context to that, because I think I can understand that. So just so people understand where that's coming from, is that essentially Because the medical community was convinced at the time that if you had the vaccine, it did reduce the risk of COVID 19 and did reduce the risk of severe COVID 19. So their perception, and I guess you could argue rightly or wrongly, was that listen, if you want to have a heart procedure, every risk that could be mitigated needs to be taken. And so, therefore, the perspective of the medical community could be that, listen, in order to have the procedure, one of the things we may have you to do is take a vaccine that would reduce your risk of severe disease. And on balance, you could argue that it's a simple procedure for the ability to get a major procedure. But I guess
Mhm.
it's equivalent to saying to someone, if you don't stop smoking, I won't do your surgery. And so that's where I think it may have gone too far.
Yeah,
What was the
yeah.
legal perspective of that?
Well, look, the worst is that this is a because I have even this paper about this matter that was published in the Spectator a couple of months ago. So if it was in the beginning of this thing, when we didn't have enough information about this particular symptom, then we could actually think, well, that's fine. They were unaware of the problem. But this is taking place now, and they continue to discriminate people on such grounds. So it is evil, in my opinion. The way that the unvaccinated was treated in Western Australia, not even Hitler sometimes would do such a thing because it was the whole population being inoculated. And those who were not inoculated lost their jobs. They couldn't even buy a beer to perhaps try to forget the problem by getting drunk because the bottle shops were also demanding vaccine mandates. You could not even have a coffee in those days.
But I guess I'm trying to see if I can get a degree of balance in terms of these
Mhm.
discussions because it is quite difficult. And I think I've come to the conclusion that a lot of people were very, very afraid. And when
Yeah.
people are afraid, they tend to do things that they wouldn't normally do. And
Hmm.
at the time, the fear that was driving the population would have caused people to make sure that any measure that could reduce their risk, their personal risk, was taken by the government to protect them. And interestingly, that fear is so deeply ingrained that even when information has come up that challenges that scientifically, the population will still not change their perception. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if is there any easy way out of that.
Look, I couldn't agree more. And another thing, I think, if I'm not wrong, a friend of mine told me so. That's much easier to deceive a fool than to make him acknowledge that he has been deceived. But in combination, now I'll try to be nicer. I'll try to be nicer. I think this is connected with the fact that some of these people vaccinated their kids as well, their children, little children, and they would never acknowledge that they have done such a terrible things, such a terrible thing to their own kids. Even to this very day, the Australian government recommends vaccination of little children. I mean, after knowing everything I know, I find this to be unacceptable. But if you have been deceived and you have had many of these shots of this experiment, I think the reality is too disgraceful and too tragic for the person to actually acknowledge his mistake. So I'm not thinking that these people will change their mind because they do not want to see the truth anymore. It's better to live in blindness. It's better to actually believe that the government had the best of the intentions and everything is going all right, even though everybody around the person, other persons involved in his life are getting into trouble. So
So how
I have never attended so many funerals in my life. That I have attended 3 funerals over the last 2 months, and
yes,
two of them were undoubtedly associated with uh, heart conditions, a heart attack.
yeah. Well, without a shadow of a doubt, I've always argued that there is a responsibility to investigate these patterns. to not
Yeah.
overlook them. And I think one of the difficulties is that many people perceive that this is the cause, so they would blame the vaccine, but we don't have the evidence. And one of the mistakes that has been made by public health, I think, is to leave it in a vacuum
Yeah.
rather than to thoroughly clarify exactly what is happening at a population level, because it only increases anxiety. But
Yeah. So,
when we look, go ahead.
but there is one detail that this exchange of information was suppressed by the Australian government, that treated those who had a concern about this as terrorists. And the government of Australia instructed the social media, Facebook and Twitter, all these different media outlets, to remove the posts of those who had some sort of modicum concern about this issue. But I'm talking about medical doctors who got censored. I'm talking about experts who know much better than those who have been chosen or handpicked by the government. So that the level of fascistic suppression of the free flow of information was mind-boggling, and actually raised my own suspicions on the subject. Why on earth they are so afraid of not allowing people who are actually experts in the field to express their opinions?
Well, here we have a realistic issue with regards to what is happening, and the CDC is seeing it now, is that there is reduced uptake of all vaccines across the board. Now,
Yeah.
their view would be, and public health's view is, oftentimes, even if a mistake was made, the damage of acknowledging it can reach other areas that had already been properly, thoroughly vetted. And
Mm.
so, in the context of protection to the population, public health could quite easily argue that actually, to protect the population, we shouldn't acknowledge any of these issues. From a
Mm.
legal perspective, is that a reasonable point?
I think there is a reasonable. This is a reasonable assumption, because those who are responsible for this potential tragedy would necessarily have to be liable for their actions. And some of these people, not only liable, but criminally liable. The Premier of Western Australia was calling those who raised some doubts on the subject, he called them dropkicks. He told that they should grow a brain. He offended them and forced them to be inoculated in order to keep their jobs. I couldn't travel I could sue him even, because I had a second job in Sydney as an adjunct professor at Notre Dame. I could not go there. I didn't renew my contract. I lost money as a result. But I saw people who didn't have their families together with them because the wife traveled overseas and she could not come back to Western Australia because the borders were closed. And not only internationally, interstate borders were closed in violation of the Constitution. Section 92 of the Australian Constitution says that the borders should be absolutely free. And they were not absolutely free at all. They were completely closed by this person with the support of the federal government.
And so the legal ramifications going forward, and this is one of the big issues, is that I think if the pandemic was over and everything was completely back to normal, and I say this in the sense that the WHO has declared the pandemic over. But
Yeah.
what I mean is that if infection levels had dropped down and everything was almost back to normal, these questions would probably be moot. But we are still probably going to see ongoing issues out of the pandemic. And from a scientific point of view, I have said that the combination of vaccine priming and recurring infection in the context of autoimmunity is extremely serious and needs to be urgently assessed from a scientific point of view. But putting that aside, is it likely that governments will have to face more legal challenges from their populations around the management of the pandemic?
Yes, but I'm not necessarily the person who is the, how can I say, the sender of the good news. And I don't think, I think there will be more legal challenges, but I'm not entirely confident about judges doing the right thing, because judges in Australia, for instance, are appointed by the government of the day. And when it comes to protecting human rights, they still apply this terrible concept coming from your country called parliamentary sovereignty, meaning that the judges are not there to uphold fundamental rights at all. By the way, the concept of parliamentary sovereignty says that the parliament can violate human rights with total impunity. And judges are chosen by the government. They attend the same clubs. If you want to see a judge, you go to the World Club in Western Australia, they will be having dinner or lunch with a politician. I was appointed because I was the senior vice president of the Liberal Party to be a law reform commissioner. I don't think I would ever be appointed a commissioner if I were not part of the political class. So it's simple as that. I do not trust enough the judiciary to do the right thing, because judge should always be appointed by merit and not by the attorney general or the government of the day, as it is the case in Australia, and certainly the same as to the United Kingdom.
So this raises serious questions going forward. I mean, there is the issue at the moment that there do seem to be some lawsuits that are coming through
Yeah.
against pharmaceutical companies with regards to the vaccine for people who have been injured. And based on what you're saying, are you suggesting that it's unlikely that these will actually be able to be overcome in the courts?
Oh, I'm not saying that people should not explore this possibility, but I'm not entirely optimistic. I'm not entirely optimistic. I feel that the best way to go is political. I think what you need to do is to learn a lesson and kick out these parasites from parliament and start to actually elect better, more decent people. I mean, I feel that what we need is to rescue our classical liberal values and traditions and put politicians who actually value the rule of law, that put a price for the protection of individual rights and freedoms. But that depends on the people. So if we are not able to make the right decisions, well, enough they can complain, because they are there. They should be working for us. They are the servants of the people. But I feel each day more enslaved by the politicians. I actually feel afraid even of open my letterbox these days. So everything
So
coming from government makes me very afraid indeed.
So one of the issues is that politicians respond to the public. And one important aspect that seems to be coming out is the fact that the politicians are reading that the majority of the public, certainly the vaccinated public, are not actually interested in doing further investigations or doing any challenge to what has happened in the past. That's a degree of protection that they have, but it is coming from the population. Is there any way around that?
Well, I think the lesson has to be learned, if not by normal, I would say less traumatic means. It will one day have to be by more disturbing and traumatic ones. The point is that uh, even to this very day, I feel that many people haven't learned the lesson. They still believe that the government is ultimate protector and provider. And it's actually playing God. It's actually believing that the government is the ultimate savior of our society. And they do not want these people to actually think that they are actually having a perception of government that's not going to lead to a good outcome. Because if you actually believe that the government is the solution for the problems, and the government can capitalize on that on this fact, then it is going to be very easy to fabricate problems, and problems will be created in order to increase the power of and control of these people who are occupying positions of power. So I feel that in the future they can come up with another crisis, and that would ultimately justify another set of authoritarian draconian measures, which will be happily embraced and accepted by the population because they are able, these people, to exchange their individual rights, their dignity, everything for protection. So protection is more important than anything else. They behave like children. They want to be looked after from cradle to grave, and that is something that, in my opinion, is a recipe for disaster.
It raises a question here, and I probably wasn't going to touch on this too much, but I think you've made a point there with regards to, say, for instance, the new WHO pandemic
Yeah.
treaty, which is there to protect the population and to act in the interest of the population and to coordinate health care activities across the world. Uh, why is that a bad thing unless you are saying that almost all the people who are involved in governments and are doing the wrong thing? I think, is that not a dangerous place to go?
Look, it's a global decision. It's going to be a decision with global effect. And I think this is always something that we should handle very carefully. Because one of the beauties about having a federal model, as we do in Australia, is that you can test ideas and test policies and laws. But if we eventually reach the point that bureaucrats at the level of this organization will decide that everybody has to be subject to certain measures in order to protect us from a particular virus or whatever, then I think this is actually going to be extremely counterproductive, even because one size doesn't fit all, and these people do not have enough even democratic legitimacy to do so. The president of the World Health Organization, he was a minister in Ethiopia, and as far as I know, he handled an epidemic over there in a very terrible fashion, so that as a result of his own measures, some people end up perishing in the process. So why on earth I'm going to trust these people to actually make decisions that are draconian but unilateral and having such an overreach impact? I just don't feel that there would be enough accountability in the process and not even democratic legitimacy for these measures to be implemented in such a manner.
Well, here is the reality of it, because when we look at the pandemic, and again, you have to pull back and imagine that we didn't know what we know now. Okay? At the beginning of the pandemic, or at the beginning of the rollout of vaccines for the pandemic, the general consensus across the world with leaders was that these vaccines were going to save the lives of the people who got them. The WHO was pleading for vaccine equity, where the
Mhm.
first world countries would share vaccines to poorer countries in order to protect them. They are vulnerable from severe disease. This did not happen. And one of the things that seems to have come out of this is that because countries were acting unilaterally in their own interest, there was no one looking out for the global interest. Do you not think that that is still a valid position, taking aside the individuals, but the structure to have an organization being able to do that?
I think it's a very dangerous idea because you know that part of the funding from this organization come from suspicious characters that I don't need to refer to their names. So, you know, if I invite my friend to have a meal with me, I think it would be out of courtesy that he's going to ask me what we are going to have for dinner. So basically, I don't like this idea that this organization is actually founded by certain groups and organizations that, in my opinion, are quite suspicious. I'm not going to refer to their names, but another thing is that if you have a problem, you have to err on the side of caution. I mean, if there was a concern about these the effects, the long-term effects of these um, vaccine, I think that it should be taken into account because we should err on the side of caution and allow people to actually make a choice if the vaccine happened to be effective. Because if I believed in the effectiveness of the vaccine, I would have nothing to fear about others taking a different position on the subject, because they would have to pay the price. They would have perhaps to even pay an ultimate price of dying for not believing the narrative of the government. But as soon as it became compulsory, that's when I started to be very suspicious and suspicious indeed about this whole thing, because there was no way of actually engaging a rational conversation during that time. It was all imposed by these dictators, and anybody who had a problem with that were treated like the Jews were treated during that period. Many people lost their jobs, lost their lives, lost even their lives, lost their families, lost their marriages. The level of madness that I have experienced over these last 3 years or so tells me that the scenario is almost apocalyptic. And I'm not happy to see what they did to my people. I'm not happy to see what they did to the Australian people over here, those who actually decided to have an opinion on this subject and paid a very heavy price for this.
Yes, this is a problem, and I think that in truth, I'm convinced that this was down to the fact that the scientific advisors to governments were not giving them adequate information. Because I think that in retrospect, I don't think that any government would have mandated vaccines if they had a better understanding of the risk benefit. But I think that they were sold on the fact that they stopped transmission. They were almost completely safe, except for a few minor potential side effects. And in that scenario, one would argue that if, with that information, a government didn't act on it, would that have been negligent? That's the other way of looking at it. And so this is why I said that even hindsight is 2020. I mean, I did have my questions about autoimmunity, but most people had no concerns about that. And so from that point of view, could we completely blame the governments for taking the actions that they did?
I think they should be extremely blamed because they used arbitrary powers. They, in the case of Australia, directly violated our constitution. There is a particular provision, that Section 51(23)(a). By the way, we do not have emergency powers in the constitution. So what they did was unconstitutional and illegal. But this particular section talks about uh, uh, the fact that nobody should be subject to any medical or pharmaceutical treatment without his or her consent. Well, that's exactly what didn't take place. So the Constitution, that provision was entirely disregarded. And there were other provisions in the Constitution that were, but emergency powers was used by Hitler. Give an example of another dictator who did this thing. The Weimar Constitution in the 1930s was not repealed. The only thing Hitler had to say is that for the health of the community, to protect them, to preserve the public health, it was important to ignore the Constitution of Germany. Well, that's what I witnessed here in Australia when the Prime Minister said that everybody should be coercively vaccinated. He said, I want the vaccines to be as mandatory as possible. And this guy claims to be a Christian and believing in rights, but he said that everybody would be subject to coercive medical and pharmaceutical treatment, which is not only immoral, in my opinion, but it is unconstitutional. And I'm waiting to see what's going to happen to these people, because how on earth they can actually violate such a clear clause in our constitution, and basically at this point, even to this very point, nothing happening about this, and they are not being held accountable.
Well, I think that my advice to anyone who is in that political position is that I think it is better to acknowledge these things early, to recognize that potentially there were risks that were not fully realized at the time, and you reverse and build back public trust by thoroughly investigating all the questions. I think that the issue that has happened around excess deaths across, especially first world countries, highly vaccinated regions,
Yeah.
that has been largely ignored will come back to bite. And that's my concern, is that my advice would have been to make sure that we demonstrate that the same enthusiasm towards mandates is also done towards investigating, protecting the health of the population after they had been implemented.
Yeah.
One point, though, is that most politicians are saying now that it was still a choice. It was not forced on any individual. They could have opted to lose their job. Yes, they could have opted not to travel. They were not forced to take a vaccination. Is that incorrect?
Well, look, it's obviously incorrect. I mean, some people had to do this in order to survive. Some people had to pay their mortgages, they had to feed their kids, and they end up having to be subject to this because of the punishments involved. Of course, it was not voluntary if you cannot even have a coffee in a coffee shop, if you cannot even buy a bottle of a wine, if you cannot do all sorts of things that I witnessed here, even being placed in a quarantine. So I mean, this whole thing that we were not forced to be vaccinated, it's actually unbelievable. How on earth someone can say the instructions are very clear. If you do not accept these mandates, you lose your livelihood, you lose your house, you might potentially lose your family and your children. So I can't see anything being more coercive than that.
Well, let me put it in a legal format. If there were people who chose not to get vaccinated and they were able to keep their jobs or find another job and their families, you could argue that it was not actually forced on everybody. It's just that the pressure to take it affected one person differently than the other. Is that a
Yeah.
reasonable legal argument?
It is a reasonable argument, but the measures were punitive, and the Premier of Western Australia actually threatened to um, uh, to arrest people who decided to, for instance, say something that was not in line to what the government wanted to advocate for. And in a certain sense, nobody likes also to be called retarded or less evolved human beings, because if you say the person needs to grow a brain, or if the person is a dropkick, you're actually dehumanizing this person, dehumanizing. So the analogy with the totalitarian past is, for be perfectly clear, the same thing was applied to the Jews, saying, "Oh, they suffer from a condition, so they have to go to the ghetto. They have to be discriminated and ostracized." But the Jews have the choice, I don't know, perhaps of leaving Germany, of disappearing. I mean, that's exactly what they did. They tried to actually eliminate those who had a little bit more of an independent mind, and were not entirely convinced that um, this experiment would work.
So, as we come close to the end here, Augusto, we are now 3.5 years down the line,
Yeah.
and you still seem to be a lone voice calling for changes to the way how things were going. Is it that the world has just moved on and they've said, listen, that was in the past, let's move on to a better future? We'll acknowledge that maybe there were some mistakes, but we have to go forward. Is that where the world is now?
Just for a while, because you refer to the excess deaths. And I have just been contacted by a professor of medicine at the University of Queensland, a very lovely lady who is a medicine professor. And she's horrified to see uh, the rise in deaths in Australia, especially after 2022. And this coincides with the period where the vaccines became compulsory. In 2021, we had lower death rates, and the death rates skyrocketed after the introduction of the vaccines. Australia is a good point, a good lab in this sense, because we didn't have so much COVID, so we didn't have so many deaths. But the deaths started to increase after that thing that was supposed to be healing us and supposed to protect us was introduced, which is very strange, don't you think? I think everybody who has a bit of a capacity to understand this matter would actually have to agree that it is strange that the death rate is so high now, and it has been so ever since the vaccine became compulsory.
Well, that is certainly true, and I've looked at some of the data. And again, the problem is that it is an assumption sometimes that
Yeah,
this is the cause, and without the thorough investigation, it will
there is a
always remain speculation. And this is
that's right.
part of why I think that the public health has a responsibility, because whichever way they take it, more and more people are asking the question, and it is best handled by just doing the investigations, looking for the associations, and making sure that it is not actually relevant. But I suspect that there could be legal consequences if there were. Is it better
Yes.
not to look?
Well, look, we don't know the long-term effects of this as well. You are better than me to think in such terms, because the vaccine being just introduced, we don't know what's going to happen in 10 years' time, for instance. So we should be very concerned if these problems are already taking place. But I think I'll be vindicated, unfortunately, because the more people start to actually pay a price for trusting in government and having their health compromised, then I think, I'm very comfortable. But above all, I want to sleep with my conscience clear. I couldn't care less about what people think. Otherwise, I wouldn't be saying what I'm saying now. I just feel that this is the right thing to do. And then I can sleep with my conscience clear. To be frank with you, and then I have to make this point. Yeah, I couldn't initially. I was not even so much focused on the efficacy of this thing. I was concerned about my body, the body of others being violated. Because whether the vaccine would work or not, it's immoral and wrong to force people to be inoculated in such a manner, especially if you believe this thing works and would protect the person who has taken the medicine. So, I mean, if I was against this whole thing on human rights grounds, regardless as to whether or not the vaccine would work.
That's an important point. And yes, we do see this in terms of clinical medicine, in that we do respect the views of patients. We accept if a patient smokes or drinks too much. We accept if somebody has a religious belief and they don't want to have specific procedures done. And you always try and respect the individual.
Yeah,
And sadly, I think that you are correct that many individual rights were not respected during the pandemic. But most importantly, they were not respected by governments, but it was sanctioned by the population. And that's
exactly.
something that we have to acknowledge, that in truth, the population did agree with the government's perspective on that. And that is probably one of the reasons why they went through with it, because they probably asked the question legally as well.
And think about this: if the government can actually inoculate a person, put whatever the government wants into your body, what prevents the government to do much worse things in the future? I think about the precedent. I think it's not just about this thing working or not. It's about what can happen in the future. We have allowed the government to do too much, to put everybody in lockdown just to save a life. But a life can be lost in the process if the remedy is worse than the disease. And I fear that this is pretty much the case, where the medicine happens to be worse than the disease.
I think that's a very important point. And so I will also remind everyone that we have here emergency powers, COVID-19 restrictions, and mandatory vaccination, a rule of law perspective. And this was written by yourself, Augusto. It's on Amazon, so it's easily accessible across the world.
Mhm.
Anything that you'd like to say about this particular book?
Well, the book, I have the book in front of me so I can actually remind myself of what I have done. But we talk about the use of emergency powers, the unconstitutionality of vaccine mandates, the context of the vaccine and international law. We talk about paternalism or the nanny state and of looking after us and the role of the paternal ruler during this period. And also civil disobedience from a legal perspective. I think there is a room for lawful resistance from time to time. And one of the chapters is about lessons from the totalitarian past that I think we should never forget these lessons. I think what that was a result of we forgetting the past. So, and we give a positive note in the end, and we say one thing that I think started, the first person who said such a thing was an Irish politician, saying that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. I think we're not vigilant enough. It's time to be again and to demand the restoration of individual rights and freedoms that have been taken away from us.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate your input, Augusto. And I'm sure I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you. It's such a great pleasure. Keep up the good work. I learned now to admire you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Could you just stay with me a moment while I play the outro? Thank you, everyone.